Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session, Digital First Publishing. It is amazing. There's so many faces today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you're all well. My name is Gemma, and I am from the Expo North Digital team. Expo North Digital is Highlands and Islands Enterprise's mechanism for specialist digital support for the creative and heritage economies across the Highlands and Islands region, and the project is delivered by Ironworks Venue. This workshop is part of HIE's Northern Innovation Hub designed to build on and accelerate business innovation. It is funded through the Inverness and Highland City Region Deal, a joint initiative supported by £315 million of investment from the UK and Scottish governments, Highland Council, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the UHI. I am now going to pass over to the fabulous Peter Erperth from the Expo North Digital team. Sit back and enjoy, everybody.
Well, thanks so much, Gemma. And yes, indeed, welcome everyone. Great to see you all. I'm Peter Erpeth, Expo North Digital Specialist Advisor in the publishing and writing sector. And I'm delighted to have with me for this session on Digital First Publishing, Jess Whitlum-Cooper of Bookoutre, who I must add, they've been nominated for Imprint of the Year at the British Book Awards, and Jenny Brown, founder and literary agent of Jenny Brown Associates. Now, before handing over to them for their introductions, just to say, if you have any questions as we go along, please put those in the chat box on the bottom rail here, and we'll pick some up. And we'll also leave time at the end to kind of get into those, so make sure they're in there. So before we get any further into this subject, I'll ask Jess and Jenny to introduce themselves, and well, start with you, Jess.
Yeah, fantastic. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here and to see so many faces. So yes, my name's Jess Whitlum-Cooper. I'm an associate publisher at Bookoutre, and I think we're going to come on to exactly what that is and who Bookoutre are in a moment. But it might be helpful just to start with a little bit about my background. So I started my career in publishing actually on the agency side, working at Curtis Brown, and I was working with agents Felicity Blunt and Vivian Schuster on some of the fantastic authors, very commercial authors, such as Jodie Cooper, Jeffrey Deaver, Tammy Cohen, The Estate of Daphne du Maurier, and lots of others. I think one of the highlights of my career was coming up with a suitably sexy horse title for Jodie Cooper's next novel. So that really is a highlight when I think back to that time. And once I left Curtis Brown, I went to Headline, which is a traditional commercial fiction publisher within Hachette, which is the second largest publisher here in the UK. And while I was at Headline, I worked on authors such as Victoria Hislop, New York Times bestseller Janet Ivanovic, and digital bestsellers Elle Cosimano and Abby Waxman, to name a few. And then at the beginning of 2022, I moved to Bookoutre, which I think we'll talk about more in a moment. But all to say, my background is quite varied. I've done the agency side, the traditional publishing side, and the digital publishing side as well. So hopefully I'm quite well placed to talk about all three, and specifically digital.
Thanks so much, Jess. Jenny.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jenny Brown. I am a literary agent based in Edinburgh, and we established the agency 22 years ago. And we set out to specialise in writing from Scotland, and we represent a wide range of Scottish writers, from the likes of Alex Gray, who's just had her 21st book published yesterday, crime writer, to historical writers, including Sally Magnuson. And we represent a number of literary estates, like we represent William McIlvanney's literary estate and also George Mackay-Brown. And I work partially with Alistair Gray's literary estate as well. So we also, as of the last 2 years, have a London arm in the shape of Lisa Heighton, who was a publisher with Hachette and is now taking on writers based not necessarily in Scotland as well.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So, well, I suppose we might as well throw ourselves right deep into this. And I'd like to ask you, Jess, first of all, right from the start, what is digital first publishing? What actually is the subject of today's event?
I mean, that is an enormous question, Peter. What is digital publishing? I hope you've all cleared your diaries for the next 3 weeks as we dive into this. No, but I will explain what digital first publishing means. It's a very Ron Seal term insofar as it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's digital first publishing insofar as publishing that prioritizes the digital editions. And usually when we talk about digital publishing, we're talking about the ebook. So that sort of ebook that you'll be reading on your Kindle or one of your other e-readers. And the term digital first actually sort of came about a long time ago, really, when ebooks were incorporated into the publishing model. So around 2010, publishers started sending out addendums saying, oh, we want your ebook rights, we want your ebook rights, and started taking ebooks on, as well as traditional print editions, such as hardbacks and paperbacks and trade paperbacks as well. And during that time, some publishers began to experiment with what was called digital first. So it was launches for books where the digital edition was the first edition that hit the market. And that's sort of where that term came from, that concept of saying, instead of launching with a hardback, we're going to launch digital first with your ebook and audio editions. Since then, that term has changed and evolved. And there are publishers such as Bookoutre now who not only are digital first, but sort of predominantly digital and really focus on digital. But really what that term means is giving an awful lot of space to the ebook edition and prioritizing that as the primary format for an author's publication. Hopefully that answers the question. Please chime in if there's anything else, Jenny, that you want to add to that, or if I haven't captured that fully, Peter.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, we will sort of unpack that as we go along as well. I mean, there's much to sort of say, isn't there, on this? But Jenny, as a literary agent, what's your kind of approach to this? Because I'm aware that this is kind of an increasing market for you and a kind of increasing involvement for you and your authors in this kind of sector. So it's definitely here. It's definitely arrived, that it's a major part of a big part of the kind of publishing world. So what's your kind of take on this, and how are you working with this as an agent?
I think I've just been really delighted to see a section of the publishing industry that has got great energy and drive at the moment, because they really are reaching readers in huge numbers. Statistics have just come out this week to show that the ebook market grew again by 6% in volume last year, which is, it's phenomenal. That something, I suppose, during the lockdown, we all expected to see ebooks, the reading of ebooks rise, and we weren't sure what was going to happen once lockdown ended and once the bookshops were open again. But in fact, I think a lot of readers have found this a very convenient way to read their favorite authors, and I've got hooked on this. And I'm sure Jess has got more statistics, but it does seem that ebooks are particularly consumed by very heavy book buyers. Isn't that right, Jess? That it's not just occasional readers who are reading ebooks, it's people who are reading a lot.
Yes, I mean, that, I suppose there's a mix, isn't there, as there would be in any market. There's always people that might buy, one book a year, or, an ebook here and there. But what we find at Bookoutre is that readers absolutely want to keep reading, and they are voracious readers, and they want ebooks that will take them all the way through the story in a sort of, whatever the genre, actually, in a very gripping way. And then they want to go on and read another book when they're finished, either as part of an author's series or the rest of the author's backlist, or they want to explore more ebooks. So we tend to find that readers can be very voracious in this area of the market. That's not to say that they're not in others, but I think the ebook market really lends itself to moving through books very swiftly and then going on to find exactly what you want to read immediately afterwards. So, there's no barrier. You don't need to go to the shop or order something online. If you have an e-reader, that sort of instant gratification of getting the next book in the series or just the next book you want to read, it's right there. And I think because of that, it has developed a pattern of readership that is, as I said, very voracious, with readers moving very quickly through an author's backlist or through a series, which tends to be the case in very commercial digital publishing.
So, Jenny,
should we just talk for? I was just going to say, should we just talk about what kind of books do especially well with as digital books, because it won't suit every sort of writer at all. I would say predominantly it's fiction, and it's Jess, come in here if I'm, predominantly genre fiction. So we're talking about women's fiction. We're talking what would categorize women's fiction. Historical fiction seems to be doing better and better. Crime writing, thriller, horror to some instances as well, doing well, and some science fiction. Is that about right, Jess, would you say?
Yeah, I would add saga in there as well. I think that lends itself
Saga, of course,
very
yeah.
digital, but essentially very commercial. And I think often there is some confusion about what commercial means. And I think it's really probably helpful to clarify that too. So commercial genuinely means sort of extremely accessible, and something that, you know, a genre that when we say commercial fiction, we are talking about the genres that Jenny just listed. So for example, psych suspense, crime thriller, women's fiction, saga, historical fiction, specifically World War II works very well in a digital marketplace when we're thinking about historical fiction. And what it means is that those books are, when they say that they're commercial, they are page turning, they are gripping, they have cliffhanger chapter endings. There's a huge amount of plot. And I think that's a really important distinction. So something, when we think about something that's more literary, potentially there is less plot, there is less action, the emphasis might be on the beautiful writing or the lyricism. When we talk about commercial fiction, we are talking about are really sort of placing most of the emphasis on that plot and moving very quickly through the book in a sort of nail-biting kind of way, which I hope kind of distinguishes what we mean when we say commercial fiction.
Jenny, does this extend to you so far that you are seeing you're kind of, you know, acquiring clients or acquiring books that you think, oh, I know this is a very good candidate for digital first publishing? I mean, is it at the point where you can make that kind of distinction? And, you know, if so, what kind of, you know, you're given a few examples there. What sort of things would instantly stick out to you as being saying, well, I'm actually gonna market this book to the digital first publishers, you know, that's where it belongs, as it were, you know? And what would be the kind of characteristics of that work?
Well, I think just as Jess says, you know, work that has big emotional impact, often does really well in digital, introduces you to, you know, from a historical point of view, it can be, you know, the two time frame type of novel, historical and contemporary in one novel, also seems to do really well in this space. I was just going to say that what's happened with publishing, it seems to me, is there's, as in life generally, there's a great polarization between what traditional publishers are looking for, and they're looking for really big books now to make a noise about. And it's very hard for some of those writers who are writing really terrific, enjoyable novels if they're not perceived to be the sort of books that you can make an enormous noise about, or if they're not by a brand name author. So for me, I'm delighted that there is an alternative to those traditional publishing models for writers who are writing these kind of really enjoyable page-turning books. It's a different model entirely. It's a different financial model, which we can come on to. But it's I would say it really has expanded the opportunities open to writers today. Oh, lost you.
Sorry, that's it. Yeah, definitely come on to all the kind of things about the kind of implications of this for writers in terms of, you know, the financials and some of the sort of contracting elements. But before touching on that, can I just ask you, Jess, so you acquire a book. What has the process of kind of from acquisition to publication changed, as well as the kind of platforms? You know, how's that looking for you? How's that working? What are the kind of differences in this process now for a publisher such as yourself?
Yeah, so sorry, do you mean what does sort of acquisition to publication look like for a digital publisher rather than traditional? Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I think in many ways it's the same in so far as, you know, editors on the traditional publishing side and on the digital publishing side are looking for that book, the one that they've really got their eye on, the thing that's sort of very gripping and page turning. And depending on what that editor is looking for, they will be hunting for that book for a long time. Once a book is acquired, there's slightly different processes at traditional publishers versus digital publishers. So traditional publishers tend to have a more formal acquisitions meeting, where a book is kind of pitched to the entire team and you get feedback from marketing and publicity, sales, cover design, your MD, and there's an awful lot feeding into that book at that exact juncture. On the digital publishing side, it's slightly more fluid insofar as we move a lot faster. I think that's probably the main takeaway of those two models, is that in digital publishing, because the market shifts so much more quickly than on the traditional market side, we are trying to be sort of as nimble as we can be on our feet when we're acquiring books. And once we have acquired a book, we'll take it through very similar processes that you would have on the traditional publishing side. You'd have a very similar critical path insofar as your editor would be working with you on structural edits, then they'd work on line edits, and then you'd usually incorporate freelancers to work on copy edits and proofreads. You'd finalize your files. Meanwhile, your editor will be busy on the cover and the copy and sort of getting ready to launch the package. But, I did mention the speed part, and on the digital side, that critical path will be probably condensed into about 6 months, typically, with a bit of wiggle room in there. On the traditional side, it could be anywhere up to 2 or 3 years. So when I was at Headline, I would acquire books. If I was there now, I would be acquiring books for 2026 or 2027. I'm currently at Bookoutre and I'm looking for books immediately, or ones that I can publish in the next 6 months. So it's just a slightly faster model. But the core mechanisms within it are the same. So you will still be edited. You will still have freelancers working on your books and be proofread and copy edited. You will still have cover designers. You will still have an editor, feeding in and working on the copy. So a lot of those key parts of the publishing process are the same. But I would say the digital side, having been on both, is just a little faster and a bit more streamlined. Whereas the traditional side, if you've got a publication date 2 years away, those edits can take as long as you would like them to, or you can start them whenever you like. The digital publishing model publishes more and probably more often. So I think it's a little bit faster, which I hope helps answer your question there, Peter.
Yeah, just does the quickness of that process, does that mean that digital publishers, digital first publishers in general, are publishing more? Do you have bigger lists? Have you got bigger plans?
We do. We have bigger lists. So we're publishing more titles than perhaps you would on the traditional side. I mean, it's hard to say exactly, because depending on what you're doing on the traditional side, you might have quite a few titles on your list. But because of the speed with which we publish for the digital market, we tend to be publishing more in a year. But there's a very key point about Bookoutre specifically that I wanted to flag, is that we cap how many titles our editors can work on, which is a really distinct point for a digital publishers. Not all digital publishers do that. So if you're ever thinking about working with a digital publisher, it's a great question to ask. Do you cap the number of titles that your editors work on? So while we're publishing a lot quite quickly in many instances, we always ensure that our editors can provide the very best author care and editorial care for every single author. And some digital publishers don't prioritize that. So they can have editors with very big workloads with a lot of titles that are then struggling to deliver that author care. So that's just a kind of interesting point of distinction that we do at Bookoutre. It's just always worth bearing in mind if you're ever working with a digital publisher. I think it's a great question to ask.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it brings us around a little bit, Jenny, to this thing about the experience for writers. So in your experience of this now, what are the differences in this process for writers, and what are the differences at the level of things like kind of the structure of remuneration from these contracts, and indeed the idea of territory and all these kinds of things? What are the changes taking place on that level in this model?
Well, the key thing, I think, for most writers to get their head around is that digital publishers typically do not pay in advance. They pay an enhanced rate of royalties on ebooks. Typically, a traditional publisher will pay you 25% of net receipts on any ebook sold. And digital publishers, some of them start at 25%, but will rapidly go up to 40%. Some are doing 45%, some are doing 50%. Another really key thing is that the amount of information at your fingertips as a writer who's published by a digital publisher, because in traditional publishing, you know the sales. Your editor may keep you up to date with sales in the first month after publication, but after that, you're waiting until your royalty statement comes in 6 months at 6-monthly intervals. Now, digital publishers are getting information the whole time, and really, really accurate and detailed information, so that for the authors that I have who've been digitally with digital first publishers, that information is coming through every week, and it's available if you want it more often. Wouldn't you say that, Jess? I mean, the communication between digital first publishers and authors is really quite exceptional.
Yeah, I mean,
fast response.
Yeah, I can specifically speak to the Bookoutre model. And I think we're very good at this, which obviously I would do. But yes, Jenny's absolutely right. I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding that editors or publishers sort of lie on a chaise longue all day and think big thoughts about books and edit with pencils. And, you know, it's not quite like that. And actually at Bookoutre, we spend an awful lot of our day. In fact, I would say the majority of our days looking at graphs and data. And Bookoutre is very specific insofar as we built all of our own data models because we were started as a startup. But what it means is that we have access to titles that are on pre-order or titles that have already launched and are then on sale. And we get that data refreshed around the world every day, and we are tracking it every day. And it's one of the key parts of our business that sets us apart from everybody else, because we can track when a title's on pre-order and see if it's tracking in the way that we want it to, if it's tracking alongside the competitors that we want it to, and if it's not, we can make a change. And the same when a title publishes, we continue to track that data, and we make changes whenever we need to, if we feel that we need to make tweaks to the title, cover, copy in order to help a book really thrive. And Jenny's right, we are very transparent. And I think most digital publishers tend to be. As I said, I can speak specifically for Bookoutre, but we are very transparent about sales information because we have it, because we have the data. We can track it all the time. So if an author or an agent is in touch asking for their pre-order numbers, for their sales figures, for their royalty payments in the next quarter, we can give them that information. And having been on the traditional publishing side, I can say that often the opaqueness around those figures can come from the fact that the editors don't have that data. They just don't know how many copies something has sold or how many pre-orders there are until an Excel spreadsheet is sent around the publisher once a week. And that is the way in which they work. So digital publishers definitely have access to more data in general, but Bookoutre specifically has phenomenal data systems that just means we have a lot of information. And we really believe that, you know, an author that signs with us, that is a business agreement, and they should know how much money they're making. They should know what's in their royalty pot at the end of the quarter. They should be able to plan their lives based on the income that they're making. So that's a really fundamental core belief for us, definitely.
Yeah, and we're talking, Pete, about rights, and each digital publisher will vary a little bit in what they're looking for rights-wise. But I think I'm right in saying, Jess, that you would expect to have world English rights because the American market is very important to many of the digital publishers. They're publishing simultaneously in both sides of the Atlantic, and often the American sales can outweigh the UK sales on an ebook.
Definitely. And I think, so at Bookoutre specifically, and this is true of a lot of digital publishers, the rights we accept as a minimum are world English language. And what that means is we want rights to your book all over the world in English. Ideally, we would like them world English language, or sorry, world all languages. But that would be a discussion about whether we felt we were the right publisher or positioned correctly if that book had potential to sell in international markets as well. But the bare minimum would be world English language. And that is not a land grab. It's not to say we just want to get as much as we possibly can. It's because the digital market space is wider. And actually at Bookoutre, 55% of our revenue is driven by the US and specifically North America. So when we are publishing, and if you look at some of our titles after this session or nip onto our website, you'll see that we are packaging our books in a way that could appeal to a US audience as well. And the reason for that is very simple. A lot of our revenue comes from the US, but if you think about, and I don't know the exact stats on population, but if you think about the fact that the UK might have 60 million people, probably slightly more than that now, but the US might have 360 million. We need to be keeping an eye on that as, you know, a very large English language market, because if we can break a book out into the States, you know, the potential revenue could be even higher than solely breaking it out into the UK market. So it's not a land grab per se, but it's because we think that if we have those rights, we can actually make more money for the author and more royalties for them.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to just go over some of the questions that people are asking.
Yeah.
So the first one of these, I'll take them in order. Do we know if series of books are more popular than standalone? That's thanks to Angela for that question. Are series of books more popular than standalone?
A great question. I think maybe not necessarily more popular, but we see a lot of success with series publishing. Especially in historical fiction, although there are series in women's fiction as well. And you can sometimes see series linking on Amazon for crime thriller as well, and psych suspense. And of course, police procedural would be a series too. The reason that it can work so well for commercial fiction is because you can finish one book and then move directly onto the next. And there's sort of immediate linking at the back of the ebook that drives you onto the next title. So that can just work so well. One sort of key thing that a lot of digital publishers do that you may have noticed as a consumer is that they will put the first book up in the series on sale, and they will put the second book up for pre-order. So when you finish the first book, you are driven to immediately pre-order the second. And sometimes we're more flexible than that. We might put the first 3 books up or the first 2 books up on the same day, but we will always ensure that that next book is available to buy or available to dive into or to pre-order. Because we find that at the end of an ebook is the very best moment in time for a consumer to make another purchase. If they've enjoyed something, they're going to buy the next book, most likely. And series as well, because you're following the same characters, there is that impulse to kind of pre-order the next book and continue the journey. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's more popular, but it can be very profitable in commercial fiction to think about linking your books, because it's such a good tool to move readers through. Otherwise, they finish a book and they think, well, that was lovely. I'll go and read something else that's on 99p. But if you have the next book in the series and they've enjoyed the series, that can work really nicely.
And Jenny, is that something in your consideration when you're approached, when you're thinking about an author has sent you something through? Do you, are there times where you think that the serialability, the serialization possibilities, is that a factor in your deliberations as well?
Yes, especially if it's something that's going to be suitable for a digital publisher. And just something else that occurs to me that, and Jess, you just touched upon, was that authors have sometimes really strong backlists, which have just been allowed to go out of print. And if an author is doing well with digital books, there's every possibility of bringing those authors' previous titles back, probably rejected. Often a digital publisher will give the author the opportunity just to bring it up to date in various ways before putting it out. But it can be just the most satisfying thing for a writer to have new readers for books that maybe have been out of print for some time. In fact, this is exceptional, I know. But I was talking to another digital publisher who said that, yes, a saga writer that they'd acquired, who'd written her books really some time ago, had earned £400,000 last year in royalties.
Yeah,
from books that she, had been out for ages.
I think part of the reason that digital publishing is so able to breathe new life into a backlist is because we're not constrained by the same things that traditional publishers are in terms of print run and stock and returns and print costs. We are very flexible. It's easy for us to rejacket something and bring it up to date. If you've got backlist that's 10 years old, we can refresh that very quickly with a brand new cover. And we don't incur the same costs that traditional publishers would if they were going to take on a backlist, rejacket it physically, print it, distribute it, sell it into retailers. There are a lot more barriers to doing that. But I think it's definitely a really exciting opportunity. I think the digital market space is more forgiving. And you can definitely breathe new life into books. Never say never, never say die. There's always a chance to sort of revitalize a backlist. I think it's a really great point, Jenny.
Just a couple of really interesting questions from Vicky Riley. Just before I get into those, so that when we kind of had a little meet online prior to this event, the issue arose of how authors feel about this. You know, many authors would have entered this process perhaps dreaming of seeing their paperback or even their hardback in a branch of Waterstones, and the kind of hit that comes from that. It's it's a good feeling, I'm sure. Are you finding, Vicky asks, that authors are enthusiastic about publishing in digital first? Have they needed encouragement that this is the best model for them?
I think some of them do need to hear more about the digital, how it works. I would just say here that for anybody who's interested, in my experience, digital publishers have terrific websites and they're very easy to access, and the information of how they work is usually up there and how to submit to them. I should say that you don't necessarily have to be agented in order to get published by a digital publisher, and many of them will take submissions direct from authors without going through an agent. Of course, lots of writers want to see their books in the bookshops. And I don't think we've yet covered the fact that digital publishers also will publish an ebook, audio, and they will also have at least a print-on-demand copies at the same time. Or in Bookouture's case, and I'm sure Jess will say this, I've got a link up with a paperback publisher who will be able to publish conventionally. So I just thought I'd do a sort of show and tell. And here are, in case you're thinking print on demand never looks as good, here is one of my, can you see it there? Anna
I think you'll have
Laughlin's
to
book.
put it in front of your face, Jenny, because it's a bit blurred with your background.
There we are. Is that better?
No, it's blurry because your background's blurred.
Oh no!
Oh no, it does look terrible now.
Oh no! I'll do something about my background. I was trying to sort of, make sure my office looked a bit tidier. But never mind. I will put the blur off so you can see that how good these books look on print on demand. And there is a way for bookshops to order these print on demand copies if there's going to be a launch or an event at festivals, etc. So don't think that you're not going to be in print as well as available in the digital sphere.
I think another point to think about, and I talk about this a lot actually with authors, because often, I might be offering them a deal and they might have a modest advance with a traditional publisher and they're genuinely trying to decide which route to go, or I might just be talking more specifically about traditional publishing. It's very personal, I think, everyone's journey to publication, and obviously writing itself is so personal. And I can completely understand that for a lot of people, the dream is to walk into Waterstones and pick their hardback off the table, or to go into Tesco and go down the book aisle and say, no, that's my book there. Isn't that cool? And I really get that. I think that a lot of us come to publishing that way. And really, digital publishing hasn't been around for that long. So that dream of going into a bookshop is that's a kind of dream that a lot of us have had for a long time or in our heads, whereas actually digital publishing is, by comparison, relatively new. I think there are lots of questions to think about on both sides, but something to be aware of is that the traditional publishing, is very competitive in terms of slots, and it is getting harder and harder to get books into bookshops and into supermarkets. And being aware of that is just part of the puzzle, really. But you'll notice this if you go into your local Tesco, and so Tesco is the biggest has the biggest book section of any of the supermarkets out there, and you'll see that you'll recognize a lot of the names. So they're quite conservative in what they buy, and so far they'll be buying established brand authors. It's very rare for supermarkets or high street to sort of get behind a debut in a very, very big way, across all of their stores. So they tend to buy established authors that they know, or sort of safe bets, really. So that's why when you walk around supermarkets, you will recognize those names. And so what the point I'm trying to make is that if you go to a traditional publisher, it doesn't guarantee that your books will be in Waterstones or in supermarkets. They likely will have a sell-in somewhere, most often the works, and they'll obviously be available on Amazon as well to purchase. But it's not always the case that they will be. Not every book can be in a supermarket or on the high street. So it's something to to bear in mind, I think people can often be disappointed by the traditional publishing model because they assume that a book contract will lead to the high street. But if you go in and look, and that's the very best market research you can do, is just look, you'll see that a lot of times, especially for supers and WH Smith, they'll be backing things that they know have a track record, which means it can be a hard space to break into as a debut author. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the financial side of things, which is what I always talk to authors about. Thinking about, for example, if you had a £3,000 or £5,000 advance from a traditional publisher, how many copies of that book would you need to sell before you earned out and started to see royalties? And Jenny touched on this earlier about the higher ebook royalty rate that a lot of digital publishers offer. How many copies would you need to sell in order to start seeing some really good royalties coming through from that model as well? And I tend to do the calculation with authors, but you can do it yourself really if you're working out sort of roughly what the royalty rates are on those contracts. But I think it's worth saying that if your dream is to be published in a bookshop, that's a really valid dream. And, you know, a lot of authors pursue that. And I think I can completely understand why. But I would argue that for commercial fiction, if you want to reach a very wide readership, digital first publishing is one of the best levers that you can have to build that audience around the world. You know, I have been amazed coming from the traditional side how many more readers I am reaching now that I'm publishing on the digital side. It's so exciting. And if you love commercial fiction like I do, we all do, I'm imagining, it's just a really fantastic model to kind of reach a huge readership around the world very quickly. And the print market in the UK is challenging. It's been challenging for a long time, but you know, the times that we live in make it even more so. So it's just something to bear in mind, weighing up. We could go into this, I'm going to stop talking, but we could talk more at length about the pros and cons of both models. But I think those are a couple of kind of key factors to think about if you're choosing between the two or thinking about which route might be best for you.
Just before coming on to the next part of Vicky's question, of course, there is always the feeling as well about how with digital publishing, the gap between the author and the reader is so much narrowed, is so quicker and so immediate. You know, in the days where the routine was that you'd find an agent, find a publisher, 2 years later your book will be for a while in a bookshop. You might do a few events around launch, but then there is that thing that happens, which is complete radio silence, that the whole world then moves on to the next person in the queue and their book. Whereas in the digital model, you as an author can maintain your proximity to your readership so much faster, and a beautiful digital product such as a really nice digital book is a great and very satisfying thing to promote and be associated with and to put out there, as is the audiobook. And I personally love that. You see things coming up, you know, these days, like kind of TikTok all the way through the kind of social media. To have a beautifully produced digital product in those spaces is also quite a buzz, I would argue. You know, now, you know, maybe I'm old enough to suggest there might even be a generational thing in some of that. But, you know, I think the idea that digital lacks that kind of, you know, feeling, I think is not entirely true. There's maybe a different buzz, but a very powerful one about the proximity that you can get as a writer to this wide global digital audience. You can, you know, I'm sure that the link between the digital product and your social media presence and the things you can do like this online is much narrower in the digital world as opposed to the analog one, and it shouldn't be dismissed as a kind of secondary in any way to that. It has its own glory and its own buzz, I think, you know. Just allied to that, Vicky's other question was, you talk about the publishing process being faster but streamlined. How do you build the sales and marketing campaign with such smaller or shorter lead times?
It's a great question. We're doing different marketing and publicity in digital publishing. So it's all online insofar as, for example, you know, your publicity campaign might involve things like cover reveals, reaching out to bloggers and reviewers, NetGalley, blog tours. We can arrange that quite swiftly. And the same for marketing. The predominantly marketing, we will be running adverts on Facebook, or, you know, running adverts on other platforms as well, driving readers to discover your books. Because we're doing that digitally, we can be very flexible about when we do it, how we do it, how much we spend on it. And our policy at Bookoutre is that we never stop spending if something is working. So if we can see that something's picking up with readers, we don't turn the adverts off. And another point that I really wanted to make is that at Bookoutre, every book gets equal opportunity. So they will get the same marketing and publicity campaigns, which means really that everything has a chance of becoming a bestseller, which is not true on the traditional publishing side, where authors are tiered, and we can talk more about that if anyone's interested. But it means that everyone sort of has that equal opportunity. And essentially, the reason we can do it, to answer the question, is because we're planning to. We know what the critical path is. We know the moment that we need to put things on NetGalley. We know the moment that we need to turn the adverts on. And we're not constrained by tube posters or getting the cover ready a year in advance to sell into supermarkets. You know, we are just much more nimble because of how we are producing our books, and we are producing a physical format in the way that traditional publishers are. So we have the POD, which means that we print when we get the orders. We're not printing thousands of copies in advance to ship to retailers. We can just be much more flexible. And our marketing and our publicity is obviously digital. So that obviously makes us more nimble as well, which I hope answers the question. If it doesn't, come back.
Jess, could we just go through some of those KUs and KMDs and KDDs, which authors will be hearing about increasingly with digital publishers?
Sure. Is it helpful if I talk a little bit about what KU is?
Yeah, I mean that. Yes, please.
Well, I spend my days talking about Kindle Unlimited, so settle in, everyone. I'm very well versed in this. So Kindle Unlimited is run by Amazon. So it's a way in which they reach more retailers, essentially. So you will have probably seen it on Amazon, KU, the ability to join KU. If you buy anything on Amazon ever, you've probably been asked if you'd like to be in KU. It is a subscription-based model. And what that means is that you pay a monthly fee to KU, which I believe is $9.99. I think at one point it was $7.99, but now it's $9.99. And it means that you can read an unlimited amount of ebooks that are in that model. So books that are enrolled in KU, if you have a KU membership, a bit like Netflix, you can just read whatever you want. So in the same way that you pay a fee to Netflix every month, if you have that service, and you can watch whatever you want, however much you want, how little you want, KU is kind of the same. So the sort of rationale behind it is that you pay your monthly fee and then you can sort of read whatever you want that's within KU. So it's very appealing for a lot of readers. It's something that Amazon is pushing a lot. You'll see it advertised. It may have already been advertised to you. And more books are going into KU. So that's something that you'll see happening on Amazon, is that you can buy an ebook, a paperback or a hardback, or read it in KU. A lot of the big publishers have started. So Bookoutre started putting things into KU at the beginning of 2022. A lot of the big publishers are now coming on board. The exception to that is Penguin Random House, which at the moment doesn't have anything in KU, but we'll see whether that shifts over time. What that means for the author, because you might be thinking, how do I make money through KU if everyone's reading on subscription? And it's slightly murky insofar as the specifics are quite hard to break down. But what it means for you as an author, if you are a publisher that has an exclusive KU agreement, if your book goes into Kindle Unlimited, it means it's one of the books that people can read as part of their subscription. And you are paid by how many pages are read each month. However, your book is still available to buy. So you don't have to worry about losing your readership because your book can be read in KU and it can be purchased online as well. So in the same way that you'd buy an ebook for $1.99 or 99p, it can still have price promotions on it as well. So it's available in two different ways. If your publisher is exclusive to Kindle Unlimited, it will only be available on Amazon as an ebook you can download, or in KU. Some publishers have an agreement that's broader, so that the ebook is still available on other retailers such as Apple and Kobo and Google Play. So that's the distinction there. And then, yes, you are paid for the number of pages that are read. So sales figures have started looking really quite different because you're sending people figures saying you've had 1.2 million pages read through KU. How exciting, rather than, X number of ebooks. So it's something that the industry sort of had to get its head around, and authors have as well. But it is a fantastically good tool for reaching more readers. And there's lots of other incentives and reasons to be in KU. There are bonuses that come out each month. If you've had a high number of pages read, Amazon will give you a bonus. It doesn't impact chart position. In fact, it can boost your chart position. So if a lot of people are reading you in KU, your ebook will start moving up the charts in the same way that it would if a lot of people were downloading your ebook. If you're in KU, you're also more likely to be selected for promotions such as Kindle Daily Deals or Kindle Monthly Deals, also known as KDDs and KMDs respectively. So there's lots of benefits of being part of the program. And really what it does is reaches a wider readership and means that your books, especially if you have lots of books or a strong backlist, readers have a lot of incentive to move through the whole backlist because it's part of their subscription model. So that's kind of a broad overview of KU, which I hope is helpful. I could talk about it till I'm blue in the face, but I won't. If there are any other questions,
we could do a week of sessions.
We could,
on it,
yeah.
and the various responses to it.
Yeah.
So two quick questions together. One from Angela. Out of interest, how many books did Bookoutre publish in a year? And secondly, from Tom and Rhonda. Is it worth publishing non-fiction titles in digital form as well as in print? Now, take that to mean in this context, how's this working out for non-fiction titles and digital first publishing?
Yeah. Well, I can speak to the question about Bookoutre. So it slightly depends is the answer to that, of how many editors we have and how many are acquiring and publishing. So every editor, it depends on what their role is, whether they're associate publishers, commissioning editors, publishing executives, or publishing directors. But I would say on average, there are kind of rough averages, but maybe about 20 or just over 20 books a year each. So it will depend on how many editors we have at the time that are sort of working. But quite a lot to answer that question. We do publish a lot of books in a year. And so we do have quite a sort of full roster of publishing, which I hope sort of helps answer that question. But again, the point there that I wanted to make earlier is that it is capped. So no more than that. You wouldn't have editors that were struggling with a workload of 50 or 60 books a year, which is not true of other digital publishers, which is just a kind of key point. And then Jenny, I don't know, the nonfiction piece. I mean, I'm happy to touch on it a little bit because at Bookoutre we have multiple imprints. So we have Bookoutre, which does our commercial fiction, Thread, which does our non-fiction, and Second Sky, which is our science fiction and fantasy imprint as well. So we have multiple avenues within Bookoutre depending on the book. If the question was whether there should be a digital edition of non-fiction, I would say absolutely yes. There's 100% a market for that, and people really do love to read non-fiction in ebook format. I don't know, Jenny, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Maybe it'd just be helpful for you to say, Jess, about what Threads will do, what kind of non-fiction, because it's quite specific, isn't it?
It is. So I don't publish onto the Thread list. So I do specialize in fiction rather than non-fiction. But Thread is sort of looking for more narrative-based non-fiction. So what do I mean by that? I mean less sort of technical non-fiction, I suppose, but fiction that is more, when I say narrative non-fiction, I mean non-fiction that sort of tells a story. So if you go on our website and have a click on the Thread link, you can kind of see our non-fiction books there, but they are sort of issue-led or question-led non-fiction that sort of sets itself up as more of a narrative. So you wouldn't necessarily get a very straightforward history book there or a manual as to how to do something. It's still sort of very commercial non-fiction insofar as even though you aren't moving through a novel, you're still moving through a story, which I hope is sort of a clear distinction there, rather than more straightforward non-fiction, which might be sort of purely factual or biographical. So we don't do any biographical books, but it might be more, based on sort of manuals or histories or biographies, which we don't do.
Yeah, interesting. So just coming on to the next question, Josh asked, should we, just regards to the American market and how important that is, should we be writing with US readers in mind, US spellings, and then he adds US characters?
My answer to that would be definitely consider it. Depending on what you're writing, I don't think there's any harm in that. There are certain things that we do for an American model. For example, as you say, I mean, the spelling and the characterizations of the characters, setting could be American. But also we find, if this is useful intel for you, that American readers don't like swearing. So if you read a Bookoutre book, you'll find that we don't have a lot of swear words or anything that's too sort of sexually explicit, because the American market's slightly more conservative than the UK one. So we bear that in mind when we're working on a book. My view is that it's good to keep an eye on these things. It's very hard, you know, if your book is set in the UK and it's very British and everyone's eating baked beans, it's not necessarily going to be a fit for the US market. But if you think it has like a broader readership, there's no harm in thinking about that and thinking about whether you can add certain elements that might appeal to a US audience. It is a very big market, and I would definitely keep it in mind when you're writing, but also if you're doing any of your own packages, if you're self-publishing or anything like that, it's definitely looking at what's working well in the US market. I would really recommend that you do that, and just have an eye on both. So yes.
For historical fiction, Jess, I think it's true to say that if you're thinking about the American market, American readers won't be familiar with certain periods of British history. I mean, it's absolutely true that a lot of London editors aren't, when I'm trying to pitch historical fiction from Scotland, won't be familiar with a lot of periods of Scottish history. So you're just thinking about sort of, you know, a narrow market or a bigger market, and obviously the American market much bigger. So I think it's true that, you know, the Second World War is working really well for you. I think 19th century is still a strong period to set novels in.
For us, you're absolutely right. The strongest period is World War II. There is a big readership for that, both in the UK and in the US, and internationally as well, depending on the book. That tends to be the area of historical fiction that we see the strongest in. I mean, you're right. There are, you know, there are exceptions to that rule, and there are other things sort of in the other parts of the 20th century, maybe the very end of the 19th century, that are strong for us. And those might be more dual timeline books, where you're going back in time, you know, historical fiction that's split between present day and the past. But in terms of being purely set within a period, we do see the most success with historical World War II fiction. And that has a sort of particularly strong appeal in the US. What will be interesting about that genre is at the moment we're seeing huge success with it. But, you know, when I started working in publishing, you could set it in the present day and in World War II. And now it's sort of having to set it in sort of the early 2000s to make sure that the timelines work, because we're getting further and further away from that particular moment of history. So it'll be really interesting to see whether that continues at the rate it is, and it is hugely popular at the moment. There's a huge appetite for it, or whether that shifts and the market changes a little bit moving forwards.
Just quickly, another question here from see if I got about children's publishing and the digital space. I mean, I'm going to take that quite broadly. Does that extend to things such as YA, or, I mean, obviously a big question about things like picture books, but in terms of text books, text content books, you know, are you in that scene, or Jenny, maybe you could say whether this is actually a growing area for in general, children's books for children?
Yeah, so we don't publish that at Bookoutre. The closest we might get is sort of romantasy, which is sort of romance fantasy that tends to have slightly younger protagonists. They tend to be sort of early 20s or late teens, early 20s. We don't publish anything for sort of teenagers or anything like that. But I don't think that is to say that market isn't popular and that those readers aren't reading on ebooks. But we don't specialize in that area. I don't know, Jenny, if you want to add anything to that, if you have any experience there.
I don't have much experience, but I understand that a lot of the you know, young adults are reading on their phones rather than on the ebook readers don't seem as popular in that for that age group.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that as well, actually, which is a really interesting point, is that also a lot of people are buying books on their phones. So if you think about the size of your phone, and then you think of the size of the thumbnail of the cover that you're looking at, that is why digital publishers go for such punchy, bold covers that are really visible. If you can't shrink your cover down to about this big and still see what it is, it's not working. So that's another really interesting point about the way that, you know, different parts of the industry will package differently. Because for digital, a lot of people are buying on their phones, not even on their computers. So the covers are, you know, really tiny, and you need to make sure that they're reading out, which doesn't answer the question about children's, the sort of younger ebook publishing. But I do think it's an interesting point. When you look at digital covers, they look different, and that's why.
Can I just ask Jess about the actual sort of writing that works? We had a chat about this earlier, and you want, of course, we all want the readers to keep reading. What does that mean in terms of the actual writing of the novel? Shorter chapters?
It's a great question.
Cliffhangers?
Yes. So we want in digital, what works really well in digital publishing, very gripping, page-turning stories that have a very clear plot and hook. And what I mean by hook is if you have to say, my book is about X and Y meets Z, you can really get that hook absolutely nailed down to exactly that. So it's very clear hook and a very gripping story. In terms of what actually we want to see inside the book, Jenny's right. We tend to function with shorter chapters because with cliffhanger endings. So you'll often see at the end of commercial fiction digital books, you know, ... or what will I do now? ? Or, you know, suddenly there was a big bang, you know, something. I mean, I'm not giving my writers credit because they write better than that. You can tell that I'm not an author. But they will end with cliffhanger endings. And the reason is very strategic is that we want readers to feel that the chapters are small and bite-sized, so they can keep reading them. And then when they get to the end of the chapter, we want them to think, oh, just one more chapter before bed. Oh, just one more chapter before I go into work. We want to have that addictive feeling moving through the ebook. So that is something that we are working with our authors on. It's also something that has been massively impacted by KU, where you are paid by the page. So we want readers to not be able to put your book down, to make it sort of as close to an addictive substance as we can, so that you really are hooked the whole way through. And that has always been the case in digital publishing, but it's becoming even more important with KU because we don't want readers to stop reading. We don't want the chapters to feel long and sort of and have the pacing slow down. We want to keep that pacing tight and gripping. We want it to feel very commercial. We want people to feel that they can manage another few more chapters and then get them really hooked on the story. And very crucially for digital publishing, we find the first 3 chapters are very, very important. If you're going to spend time doing another edit on your novel, look at those because that seems to be where readers decide whether they're going to keep reading or not. So the tighter you can make them, the more you can polish them, the punchier they can be. The cliffhanger ending of all cliffhanger endings on every single one of those chapters is so important. And then once you get to chapter 3, never say never, but readers tend to be invested enough by that point that they will carry on through.
Yeah, they're so interesting. There are actually kind of real implications in the process of writing and the concept of your work, if this is where you want to aim your work at. Jenny, is that something do you pick that up as well early? I mean, are you looking for that as well? Or is this something that's kind of can be to an extent edited into a book as opposed to being up and ready when you receive it and it's, you know, kind of marketing onward from you?
But I guess it's always been there in commercial fiction, but even more so now. And as Jess says about the impact of Kindle Unlimited on readers' habits of just wanting to get to the next page, wanting to get to the next chapter. And so it's something I've become increasingly aware of, just very recently because of KU.
And it's, you know, not to kind of keep harking back to the Netflix model, but it's the same reason that your Netflix loads the next episode for you. They know you're there and you're hooked and they want to kind of keep moving you through. And so it does kind of touch slightly on that model when we think about, you know, how can we hook in a readership and keep them engaged. And I would say as well that as an editor, it's something that I work with my authors a lot on shortening their chapters or adding in some more chapter breaks, working on those cliffhanger endings. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect by the time it reaches us. You know, your agent or your editor, you know, we can sort of reverse engineer it to a certain extent. If the content of the book fits in and would work well for the digital market space, there's no reason that you can't have an edit that focuses on that and that pacing.
Well, look, Jess and Jenny, thanks so much. I'm afraid, as always in these things, we've run out of time. There are a few more questions, and I'll come on to those when this goes online. I'll try and address those things in the comments of the video. So we won't leave those out, but we'll come to those in a different way. I'm absolutely sure that this is an area as it evolves as well, which I'm sure it will do, and as it responds to different things. You know, we talk here about the impact of Kindle and the way that is structuring, as it were, the nature of this kind of publishing to some extent. that always changes. It constantly changes, and it's a dynamic process, the digital space, and one in which we're all kind of both, pushing and drifting along in, simultaneously. So I know we'll be back at this, and thanks so much, Jess and Jenny, for your participation. It's absolutely fascinating, and really glad that we got around to covering this this session here at Expo North Digital. And that said, I'm going to hand over to Gemma.
Thank you. Jess, Jenny, Peter, thank you so much for giving up your time this afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining us. What a wealth of information crammed into 60 minutes, and as Peter said, we could be talking about this all day. It was absolutely fantastic. I've kept a note of everybody's questions, so I can pass that on to Peter, and we'll get those addressed for you, so please don't worry if your question wasn't answered today. There's only so much time we can talk, I'm afraid, but thank you so much for joining us today. It was absolutely fantastic. Please do visit our website, www.exponorth.co.uk, where you can look at our events section and sign up to our newsletter to be kept up to date with future events and news. Also on the website, we have our video archive, loads of extremely interesting content on there as well. So please do go and have a look and see if anything takes your fancy. And our inquiry form for specialist sector support is also there as well. So if there's anything you would like to discuss with us and think that possibly we could help you, please do fill the form out. You're only going to know if you try. So absolutely get in touch with us, and we'd be delighted to speak to you. Make sure to connect with us on Facebook, X, also known as Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. And once again, thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful weekend. I hope to see you again in the future. Take care.